The dust settled on Lillian's last hope as the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the rutted road, leaving only tire marks where her life used to be. Sophie's small hand clutched her worn dress, 5 years old and already learning that home could vanish like morning mist. The eviction notice crumpled in Lillian's pocket felt heavier than the few belongings she could carry, and the Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, beautiful and merciless as a broken promise. Every step toward the distant ranch felt like walking toward the edge of the world, where a stranger named Elias Kent might offer shelter, but at what cost to her soul? Subscribe now to discover if desperation can bloom into something beautiful. The wind whispered secrets she wasn't ready to hear. The morning sun painted the Montana landscape in shades of amber and regret as Lillian Moore stood before the weathered gate of the Kent Ranch. Her calico dress, once her Sunday best, now bore the dust of 3 days walking and the salt stains of tears she'd refused to let Sophie see. The child's weight had grown heavier with each mile, not because Sophie had gained pounds, but because hope itself had become a burden too great for Lillian's shoulders to bear. Behind them, the road stretched back toward Bozeman like a scar across the prairie, marking the path from everything they'd lost to this moment of reckoning. The ranch house stood silent in the distance, its windows dark as closed eyes, offering no hint of welcome or rejection. Sophie stirred against her mother's chest, her small fingers tracing patterns on Lillian's collarbone, while she slept the deep sleep of children who trust completely in their mother's strength. The irony wasn't lost on Lillian. Here she stood, 28 years old and feeling ancient, carrying the one person who believed she could move mountains when she could barely lift her own feet. The eviction had come swift as a prairie storm, the landlord's words still echoing in her mind. No work, no husband, no hope. Find somewhere else to be a burden. She'd packed their lives into a single carpet bag, leaving behind the rocking chair her mother had given her and the quilt that had covered Sophie since birth. Some losses cut too deep to carry. The gate's iron latch felt cold beneath her trembling fingers, and for a moment she hesitated, knowing that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no pretending she was anything other than desperate. The letter in her pocket, a response to her carefully worded advertisement in the Bozeman Chronicle, had been blunt in its honesty. Your daughter needs shelter, and I need a woman. Come if you're willing to earn your keep. No poetry, no promises, just the stark arithmetic of survival. She'd read those words 100 times during their journey, each reading making them feel more like a noose and less like salvation. Yet here she stood, because sometimes the only choice left is the one that terrifies you most. The ranch spread before them like a kingdom of solitude, with fields that rolled toward the mountains in waves of green and gold. Cattle dotted the pastures like dark punctuation marks against the endless sentence of sky, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lonely sound of a windmill turning in the breeze. This was Elias Kent's domain, a man she'd never met, but whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Widowed young, they said, and grown hard as winter stone in the years since. The kind of man who spoke in actions rather than words, who measured worth in work done rather than promises made. She wondered if he would see her as salvation or simply another mouth to feed. Sophie's breathing changed, signaling the approach of wakefulness, and Lillian felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with knowing she would soon have to explain why they were standing at a stranger's gate instead of sitting at their own kitchen table. How do you tell a 5-year-old that the world has rules too cruel for children to understand? That sometimes mothers have to make bargains with devils just to keep their angels fed? The weight of these unspoken truths pressed down on her like the Montana sky itself, vast and inescapable. She shifted Sophie to her other arm and pushed open the gate, the hinges crying out like a wounded bird. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel path seemed to announce her surrender to the empty air, each step a small defeat that brought her closer to whatever waited inside that silent house. She thought of her own mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered what advice she might have whispered in this moment of reckoning. "Pride is a luxury the poor can't afford," she might have said. Or perhaps, "Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire." But her mother had never stood where Lillian stood now, carrying a child toward a stranger's mercy with nothing to offer but her willingness to endure whatever came next. The front door opened before Lillian could raise her hand to knock, as if the house itself had been watching her approach through those dark windows. Elias Kent filled the doorframe like a mountain given human form, broad shoulders that spoke of years wrestling with stubborn land, hands scarred by honest work, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over distant peaks. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 38, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from sun and wind rather than easy living. His gaze moved from her face to the child in her arms, then to the carpetbag at her feet, taking inventory of her desperation with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to measure everything twice before making any investment. "Mrs. Moore," he said, his voice carrying the rough music of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. There was no warmth in his greeting, but no cruelty either. Just the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that hope was a dangerous luxury in a land that promised nothing but what you could wrest from it with your own two hands. Sophie stirred at the sound of his voice, her sleepy eyes opening to study this stranger who might become their salvation or their ruin. Lillian felt the child's small body tense with the instinctive wariness of someone too young to understand the adult world, but old enough to sense when the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "Mr. Kent," Lillian replied, her voice steadier than she felt, though she could hear the tremor beneath the words, like ice cracking under spring sun. "I received your letter. We've come a long way." The understatement hung between them like morning mist, carrying the weight of 3 days walking, 2 nights sleeping under stars, and the complete collapse of everything she'd once called home. He stepped aside without ceremony, gesturing them into a front room that spoke of masculine solitude, furniture built for function rather than comfort, walls bare of the small touches that made a house into a home. The absence of a woman's influence was as obvious as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Sophie's head turned to take in their surroundings, her child's curiosity temporarily overriding her shyness as she catalogued this new world of leather chairs and gun racks, of windows that looked out onto endless sky rather than neighboring houses. "Mama," she whispered, her voice carrying the question she was too young to articulate. "Where are we, and why does it feel like we're standing at the edge of everything familiar?" Lillian's arms tightened around her daughter, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the man watching them both with those storm cloud eyes. He saw everything, she realized. The way her dress hung loose from too many missed meals, the careful way she held herself as if expecting another blow, the fierce protectiveness that radiated from her like heat from a forge. "The arrangement I proposed in my letter," Elias said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "It stands as written. You'll keep house, cook, tend the garden. In return, you and the child have shelter, food, protection." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face, and she felt the weight of what he wasn't saying pressed down on her like a physical thing. "But understand this. I'm not running a charity. This is a working ranch, and everyone earns their keep. That includes sharing my bed when I require it." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Sophie, mercifully, was too young to understand the full meaning of his terms, but Lillian felt each word like a brand against her skin. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind moving through the eaves and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the evening. Lillian looked down at Sophie's trusting face, at the way her daughter's small hand had found its way to the worn fabric of her dress, anchoring herself to the one constant in a world that had proven itself capable of vanishing without warning. This was the moment of choice, she realized, the crossroads where desperation met dignity and only one could survive. She thought of the empty road behind them, of the sheriff's cold eyes as he'd watched them gather their few possessions, of the long nights ahead with no roof over their heads, and winter coming like a promise of death. "I understand your terms," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of surrender disguised as acceptance, and in that moment something shifted in the room like the first crack in a dam that had held back a flood for too long. "Continue Comos Capítulos 3-5, por favor." The morning came, with the kind of silence that settles over places where decisions have been made in darkness. Lillian woke to the sound of Sophie's gentle breathing beside her, the child's small hand still clutching the corner of the quilt that smelled of lavender and years of solitary nights. Through the thin curtain, she could see Elias moving across the yard with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to fill his days with purpose to keep the emptiness at bay. His shoulders carried the weight of routine, each step deliberate, each gesture a small rebellion against the loneliness that had become his constant companion. The coffee pot rattled in the kitchen below, a domestic sound that felt foreign in her ears after months of uncertainty and fear. She had slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks, yet rest had eluded her, her mind circling around the bargain she had struck like a moth drawn to flame, knowing it would burn, but unable to resist the warmth. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she rose, each sound a reminder that she was no longer drifting through the world like smoke, but anchored to this place by threads of necessity and something else she dared not name. Sophie stirred as the first rays of sunlight painted golden squares across the wooden floor, her eyes opening with the trust that only children possess, the kind of faith that believes the world will provide what it needs. "Mama, are we staying here?" she whispered, her voice carrying the hope of someone who had learned too young that homes could disappear like morning mist. Lillian smoothed her daughter's hair, the gesture automatic and tender, a mother's touch that could heal wounds that hadn't yet formed scars. "For now, sweetheart," she replied, the words carrying more weight than any promise she had ever made, because this time she meant to keep it, no matter the cost. The child's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains, pure and untainted by the complexities that had brought them to this threshold. Outside, she could hear Elias talking to his horses, his voice gentle in a way that surprised her, revealing depths beneath the surface of his stern proposition. The sound drifted through the window like a lullaby, speaking of patience and understanding that existed in the spaces between his carefully chosen words. Breakfast was a careful dance of politeness and unspoken questions, the three of them moving around each other like strangers learning the steps to an unfamiliar waltz. Elias had prepared eggs and bacon with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, but he had set 3 plates on the table with a deliberateness that spoke of hope carefully contained. Sophie chattered about the horses she had glimpsed through the window, her excitement filling the spaces where adult conversation faltered, her innocence a bridge between two people who had forgotten how to trust. Lillian watched Elias listen to her daughter with genuine attention, his weathered hands still as he focused on Sophie's animated description of the mare's gentle eyes. There was something in his expression that reminded her of a man remembering what it felt like to have purpose beyond mere survival, a glimpse of the father he might have been in another life. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, each sip a small act of faith in the possibility that this arrangement might become something more than a transaction between desperate souls. The conversation turned to practical matters with the careful precision of people testing the boundaries of their new reality. Elias spoke of chores that needed doing, of the garden that had gone wild without a woman's touch, of the house that echoed with too much emptiness for one man to fill alone. His words were measured, but Lillian could hear the longing beneath them, the admission that he had been drowning in solitude without realizing it until now. She offered her skills tentatively, speaking of cooking and mending, of the small domestic arts that had kept her and Sophie alive during their darkest hours. There was dignity in useful work, she knew, a way to transform charity into partnership that would allow her to sleep at night without feeling like a beggar at his table. Sophie listened with the solemn attention of a child who understood that grown-up conversations determined the shape of her world, her small face serious as she absorbed the weight of decisions being made around her. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the kitchen table, where 3 lives were slowly beginning to intertwine, like vines seeking the same sun. As the day progressed, Lillian found herself moving through the house with growing familiarity, her hands learning the rhythm of tasks that felt both foreign and natural. The kitchen welcomed her touch, responding to her efforts with the satisfaction of a space that had been waiting for purpose, and she began to understand why Elias had spoken of needing a woman's presence in his home. It wasn't just about the cooking or cleaning, though those things mattered. It was about the way a house became a home when it held the sound of a child's laughter and the rustle of skirts moving through rooms that had known only the heavy tread of boots. She found herself humming as she worked, a habit she had lost during the months of uncertainty, and the melody seemed to awaken something in the walls themselves. Sophie helped with the enthusiasm of someone finally allowed to belong somewhere, her small hands eager to contribute to the magic of making a place their own. The afternoon stretched before them like a promise, filled with the possibility that this strange arrangement might grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for when desperation first brought them together. The evening approached with the weight of unspoken expectations, the knowledge that night would bring them face to face with the reality of their bargain in ways that daylight had allowed them to avoid. Lillian felt her heart quicken as shadows lengthened across the yard, her mind racing between fear and something that felt dangerously close to anticipation, because Elias Kent was not the cold stranger she had expected, but a man whose loneliness matched her own in ways that made her chest tight with recognition. The sun died behind the mountains with the slow agony of something beautiful coming to an end, painting the sky in shades of amber and regret that reminded Lillian of all the sunsets she had watched alone. Sophie had fallen asleep in the parlor chair, her small body curled like a question mark against the worn fabric, exhausted by a day of exploration and the simple joy of having space to run without fear of being told to move along. Elias stood at the window watching the last light fade from his land, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, a man caught between the day he had lived and the night that stretched before them like uncharted territory. The house settled around them, with the creaking sounds of old wood adjusting to new weight, as if the very structure was learning to accommodate the presence of people who might stay long enough to leave their mark on its bones. Lillian moved through the kitchen with careful precision, cleaning the dishes from their shared meal, her hands finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of domestic tasks that made her feel useful rather than merely tolerated. The silence between them had grown heavy with awareness, each stolen glance a reminder of the agreement that hung over them like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. When Elias finally turned from the window, his eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, but there was no demand in his gaze, only a question that he seemed afraid to ask aloud. "I'll carry her upstairs," he said quietly, nodding towards Sophie, and the gentleness in his voice when he spoke of her daughter made something flutter in Lillian's chest, like a bird testing its wings. She watched him lift the sleeping child with the careful reverence of a man who understood the sacred trust of holding someone else's most precious thing, his large hands steady and sure as he cradled Sophie against his chest. The sight stirred memories she had buried deep, of her own father carrying her to bed when she was small, of the safety that came from being held by someone strong enough to keep the world at bay. Sophie stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her face peaceful in the way that only children could manage, trusting completely in the arms that held her. Lillian followed them up the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with each step that brought them closer to the moment when pretense would fall away and they would have to face the reality of what they had agreed to become. The upstairs hallway stretched before them like a bridge between two different lives, the floorboards worn smooth by years of solitary footsteps that had never had to consider another's needs. Elias paused at the door to what had clearly been prepared as Sophie's room, a small space with a window that looked out over the pasture where his horses grazed in the moonlight. The bed was child-sized, covered with a quilt that looked handmade, and Lillian realized with a start that he must have spent the day preparing for their arrival in ways that went beyond mere obligation. He laid Sophie down with the tenderness of someone who had perhaps once dreamed of tucking his own children into bed, his weathered hands smoothing the covers with a care that made Lillian's throat tight with unexpected emotion. The child murmured something in her sleep, a fragment of a dream that might have been about horses or home, and Elias smiled with genuine warmth before stepping back to let Lillian say her own goodnight. She kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood that always made her feel both fierce and fragile, a mother's love that could move mountains or break her heart with equal ease. The master bedroom waited at the end of the hall like a destination they had been traveling toward since the moment she had knocked on his door, and Lillian felt her courage falter as they stood on its threshold together. The room was Spartanly furnished, but clean, dominated by a bed that suddenly seemed both too large and too small for what was about to happen between them. Elias moved to light the oil lamp on the dresser, his movements careful and deliberate, giving her time to change her mind or flee if that was what her heart demanded. The golden light flickered across his face, revealing the uncertainty he had hidden behind his stern proposition, and she realized that he was just as afraid as she was, just as unsure of how to navigate the space between necessity and desire. "Lillian," he said her name like a prayer or a question, and she heard in it all the loneliness of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to speak a woman's name in the darkness of his own bedroom. The sound of it on his lips made her feel real in a way she hadn't experienced in months, as if she existed as more than just a mother struggling to survive, but as a woman worthy of being seen and wanted. She moved toward him with steps that felt both inevitable and chosen, her hands trembling as she began to unbutton her dress with fingers that had grown clumsy with nervousness and something that might have been anticipation. He watched her with eyes that held reverence rather than hunger, as if he understood that what was happening between them was sacred in its own way, a communion of two souls who had found each other in the wilderness of their separate sorrows. When she stood before him in only her chemise, she felt vulnerable but not ashamed, because there was something in his gaze that made her feel beautiful rather than merely desperate. His own hands moved to his shirt with the same careful deliberation, and she saw that his body bore the scars of hard work and harder losses, marks that told the story of a man who had survived by learning to endure. The space between them seemed to pulse with possibility, charged with the electricity of two people discovering that what had begun as a transaction might become something neither of them had dared to hope for in their darkest hours. When he finally reached for her, his touch was gentle enough to make her weep, because it had been so long since anyone had held her as if she were precious rather than merely convenient. His hands mapped the landscape of her body with the reverence of a man who had been wandering in the desert and suddenly found an oasis, and she responded to his touch like a flower turning toward the sun after a long winter. There was no urgency in their joining, only the slow recognition of two people who had been broken by life, discovering that their jagged edges might fit together in ways that made them both whole again. And in the darkness of that room, surrounded by the vast silence of the Montana night, they found something that felt dangerously close to home. Dawn crept through the curtains with the hesitant light of something afraid to disturb what it might find, and Lillian woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth beside her that wasn't her daughter's small body seeking comfort in the night. Elias lay sleeping with his face turned toward her, the harsh lines of his features softened by rest and the golden light that painted everything in shades of possibility rather than desperation. His breathing was deep and even, the rhythm of a man who had found peace for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, and she allowed herself the luxury of studying him without the weight of his gaze in return. There were silver threads in his dark hair that caught the morning light like promises, and scars on his hands that spoke of a life lived with purpose and pain in equal measure. She had expected to feel shame in the cold light of morning, the regret that comes from choices made in darkness, but instead she felt something that might have been contentment settling in her chest like a cat finding the perfect spot in a patch of sunlight. The night had changed something fundamental between them, transforming their arrangement from a business transaction into something that defied easy definition, but felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. Sophie's voice drifted up from downstairs, the sound of a child who had woken to find herself in a place that felt safe enough for singing, and Lillian felt her heart lift with a joy so pure it made her eyes sting with unshed tears. She slipped from the bed with careful movements, not wanting to wake Elias, but needing to go to her daughter, to see for herself that this wasn't just a beautiful dream that would dissolve with the morning mist. Her bare feet found the cool floorboards, and she pulled on her dress with hands that remembered the tenderness of the night before, her body carrying the sweet ache of being thoroughly loved by a man who had treated her like something precious rather than merely available. The mirror on the dresser showed her a woman she barely recognized, someone whose eyes held light instead of the dull resignation that had become her constant companion during the months of wandering. Her hair was tangled from sleep and passion, but there was color in her cheeks and a softness around her mouth that spoke of kisses given and received with equal fervor. She looked like a woman who belonged somewhere, who had found her place in the world, rather than simply enduring it. Downstairs, Sophie was attempting to make breakfast with the enthusiasm of someone who had decided that this house was home, and she was going to contribute to its magic, whether anyone asked her to or not. Flour dusted the counter like snow, and there were eggshells scattered across the table, evidence of a 5-year-old's ambitious culinary plans that had perhaps exceeded her technical abilities. "Mama!" Sophie called when she saw Lillian in the doorway, her face bright with the kind of happiness that only children could achieve, pure and uncomplicated by the weight of adult concerns. "I'm making pancakes for Mr. Elias because he was nice to us, and I think he's lonely like we were." Oh, the simple wisdom of her daughter's observation hit Lillian like a physical blow, because Sophie had seen what she herself was only beginning to understand, that Elias Kent was not a man taking advantage of their desperation, but someone whose need for companionship matched their own need for shelter. The kitchen felt different in the morning light, less like a stranger's space, and more like a place where she might learn to belong, where the sound of her daughter's laughter could echo off the walls without fear of being told to keep quiet. Elias appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the sound of their voices, his hair still mussed from sleep and his shirt hastily pulled on. But there was something in his expression that made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. He looked at them, at her and Sophie working together in his kitchen, with the wonder of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to wake up to the sound of life filling his house. "Good morning, ladies," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there the day before, as if the night had thawed something in him that had been frozen for too long. Sophie beamed at him with the confidence of a child who had decided he was worthy of her trust, and she began to chatter about her pancake-making efforts with the kind of detailed explanation that only 5-year-olds could provide. Lillian watched him listen with genuine attention, his weathered face softening as he took in Sophie's animated description of her culinary adventure, and she felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't even realized was closed. The morning unfolded with the careful choreography of people learning to share space without stepping on each other's hearts, and Lillian found herself moving through the routine of breakfast with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. Elias helped Sophie salvage her pancakes with the patience of someone who understood that small disasters were part of the joy of having a child in the house, and together they created something that was edible, if not exactly pretty. The conversation flowed easier than it had the day before, lubricated by the intimacy they had shared in darkness and the simple pleasure of watching Sophie's delight in having two adults focused on her happiness. There were moments when their eyes met across the table, and Lillian felt the heat of memory pass between them, reminders of the night that had changed everything. But there was also something deeper growing in the spaces between those glances, the recognition that what they had found together might be worth fighting for. The coffee was strong, and the pancakes were slightly burned, but it was the best breakfast Lillian had eaten in longer than she could remember, because it tasted like hope and possibility, and the radical idea that she might deserve happiness after all. As the morning progressed into afternoon, they fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, like a dance they had always known but never had the chance to perform together. Elias showed Sophie how to feed the horses while Lillian worked in the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables that had been struggling without proper care. The work felt good under her hands, purposeful in a way that reminded her of who she had been before desperation stripped away everything except the need to survive. She could hear Sophie's delighted squeals from the pasture as one of the mares nuzzled her palm, looking for treats, and Elias's patient voice explaining how to approach the animals with respect rather than fear. The sound of their interaction made her chest tight with emotions she was afraid to name, because it looked too much like the family she had dreamed of giving her daughter but never thought she would find. The sun was warm on her back as she worked, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond the next meal or the next place to sleep. A future that might include laughter and love, and the simple pleasure of watching her daughter grow up in a place where she was wanted rather than merely tolerated. The day ended as it had begun, with the three of them gathered around the kitchen table, sharing a meal that tasted like home, and Lillian realized that somewhere between desperation and dawn, she had stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement and started thinking of it as the beginning of something that might last forever. If they were brave enough to let it,